The year 1788. The Austrian army is preparing for battle. But here's the paradox. The enemy never showed up, but the battle took place anyway. Bloody, brutal, senseless, because some soldiers mistook others for the enemy, and the battle began. It's not fiction. This is a real episode in which an army destroyed itself. The story of the Kolin disaster, the most ridiculous and tragic mistake on the battlefield. In the year 1785, Europe was gripped by wars. The confrontation of great powers, the struggle for territory and prestige did not stop. One of the most confusing and strange pages of military history is the battle in which the Austrian army actually defeated itself. How is this possible? How did an army organized, supplied, and trained to fight an external enemy suddenly find itself against itself? This event is called the Battle of Kolin, which took place in the year 1780. It wasn't just a case of loss of control. It was a massive tragedy in which Austrian troops mistook their own for their enemies, and in the end, the army won, but not the one they expected. What happened on this day? How could such a nightmare become a reality for the powerful Austrian army, and what consequences did this strange mistake have for all of European politics? To understand how this could have happened, it is worth diving into the context of the time. The late 18th century was a time of great military conflicts. The Austrian Empire, as a powerful nation, was involved in many wars, and its army was on constant alert. However, despite its size, the army was overwhelmed by numerous tasks, and its command began to face a coordination problem. At this point, the Austrians were fighting numerous opponents, including the French, Russians, Prussians, and rebellions in various parts of their empire. One of their main tasks was to defend territories in Central Europe and to maintain influence over crucial strategic regions. The problems of coordination in the army became particularly evident during one of the army's largest operations involving the suppression of a rebellion in the German Länder. The Austrian command was hampered by rapid movements and numerous changes of command. However, it was under such circumstances that a fatal misunderstanding occurred. On 12th of June, 1788, at the Battle of Kolin, the Austrian army stationed in Germany stood against its own troops. How was this possible? How did it happen that the army, instead of fighting the enemy, actually faced itself? The reasons for this amazing event lay in the division of forces and lack of coordination between the different parts of the Austrian army. At that moment, the commands got mixed up, and the military, oriented towards a common task and trying to seize strategic positions, started to engage each other. Information about the position of forces on the battlefield became misinterpreted by the commanders. Instead of observing the correct division of front lines and clear signals, soldiers mistook neighboring troops for the enemy. This caused parts of the army to start fighting each other, literally trapped in their own mistakes. The battle process itself was a terrible confusion. Some parts of the Austrian army began shelling others they were supposed to be fighting on the same side. Noises, signals, and lack of clear instructions caused both units to start beating each other. The battlefield was covered in uncertainty and chaos, and orders and signals were inadequate. A lot of soldiers mistakenly thought that there were opponents present on the battlefield and started attacking. The forces that were supposed to be together separated and then engaged each other. This moment can be called the epitome of a military disaster in which everything went wrong. For the Austrian command, the situation was a complete nightmare. After the battle began, it turned out that neither side understood who the enemy really was. Scattered parts of the army started trying to find a solution amidst the chaos, but due to the lack of a unified command and the unclear situation, orders came late. The Austrian army was faced with extremely inefficient coordination between different parts of the army. Unit commanders were unable to cooperate with each other, and the movement of army units in the midst of intense fighting accelerated the confusion. By the time the army chiefs realized that they were fighting each other, it was too late to stop the fighting. In the end, the Austrian army won, but this victory was fatal to its internal integrity. Many soldiers were killed, and others were seriously wounded in their own battle. The losses were enormous. Approximately 3,000 Austrian soldiers died in the confused fighting. This was not just a defeated army, but a loss that left a void in the ranks. Soldiers who were supposed to be allies became adversaries. Someone in command was arrested for allowing the disaster to happen. This incident was the result of many factors. Failure to coordinate troops effectively under military tension, poor cooperation between units, and command overload were the main causes of the disaster. Added to this was a mistake in defining objectives. Commanders could not clearly distinguish their forces from those of the Allies. Either way, the disaster had important consequences for military tactics of the time. The battle was a lesson to all armies, reminding them how important it was not only to be strong, but also to be able to coordinate their forces in war. Although many years have passed since then, the lessons of the Battle of Kolin are still relevant today. They show how important it is to be coordinated and make no mistake at the critical moment. Sometimes even the most powerful army can face unpredictable consequences if internal processes are not controlled. The Battle of Kolin, although it remained unnoticed against the background of other great battles of the 18th century, is a terrible example of how poor coordination and command errors can lead to disastrous consequences. After the Austrian army defeated itself, the consequences of the incident were far-reaching. Although the battle was fought as part of a much wider conflict, this terrible mistake jeopardized all of the Austrian command's plans. As a result, despite the victory, the army suffered serious losses and was forced to endure internal disharmony. One of the most serious consequences was that the army's internal problems greatly weakened its fighting ability. Unit commanders who were involved in the incident were forced to resign, and in some cases, they were even arrested for failing in command. This left the army without influential leaders, which was extremely dangerous in a war situation. But apart from this, the disaster that occurred taught a great lesson not only to the Austrians, but also to the entire European military community. The incident at Kolin showed how unfortunate a situation can be in the absence of communication, lack of coordination, and unclear understanding of strategic objectives. The losses suffered by the Austrian army during this battle were significant. 3,000 soldiers, among them many experienced fighters, were killed or wounded. However, much more damage was done to the army in terms of demoralization. For the soldiers who were part of this battle, losing comrades and taking part in the battle against their own comrades in arms was a severe psychological blow. Fear and insecurity among the Austrian soldiers was one of the consequences of this incident. Soldiers who were supposed to be fighting an external enemy now wondered who was an enemy and who was an ally. This confusion seriously undermined the morale of the army, and for many months, commanders struggled to restore the fighting ability of their troops. After the Kolin incident became publicized, reforms began in the Austrian army. These mainly concerned the chain of command and the warning system. New methods of information exchange were introduced, as well as a system for autonomous unit control. Strategic tasks were more clearly delineated to prevent further misunderstandings. Perhaps it was after this battle that commanders began to pay more attention not only to military training, but also to the cooperation between different parts of the army, which later helped to avoid similar mistakes in other battles. Instead of trying to apply old methods of warfare, the Austrians began to develop new approaches to command that focused on more rapid response and technical preparedness of troops. Even afterwards, however, the experience of the Battle of Kolin remained in historical memory as a cry of warning about the importance of coordination and communication. Although the battle itself had no strategic significance in the context of the overall military conflict, its effects were felt throughout Europe. Externally, the war continued, but the internal problems of the Austrian Empire became visible to neighboring powers. The French, Prussians, and even the Russians could not help but notice that the Austrian army was going through a period of weakness. The impact on the strategy of other states was enormous. Neighboring countries began to revise their strategies and plan potential operations with the Austrians' mistakes in mind. Countries that had previously looked to Austria as a powerful ally were now wary of its internal affairs, realizing that its army could be vulnerable in the event of a major military clash. Paradoxical as it may sound, the Battle of Kolin gave rise to new military concepts that became the basis for the development of modern armies. The complexity of troop coordination, the psychological aspect of warfare, and the importance of coherence were the main lessons learned not only by the Austrians, but also by other European powers. The reaction to the events at Kolin influenced the development of military theory. A host of military analysts, both in Austria and abroad, began to develop new warfare strategies that were based on the coordination of troops, the use of modern communications, and clear instructions for commanders. For several years after the Battle of Kolin, the Austrian army experienced psychological trauma that affected its internal fighting ability. Comrades who had once fought side by side were now each other's enemies. Faced with the reality of war, soldiers became wiser, but also wary. Over the years, the Austrians, following new methods, worked to rebuild the lost trust between units. In the battles that followed, there were already fewer confused attacks, and mutual understanding and command began to work with much greater efficiency. Although the Battle of Kolin remains one of the strangest events in military history, it brought valuable lessons for all powers. The battle reminds us that even the greatest armies can have moments of confusion that lead to disastrous consequences. However, like any mistake, it also provided an opportunity to evolve and improve efficiency. Had it not been for the Battle of Kolin, the Austrian army may never have taken the steps that would have helped it maintain its influence over Europe in the decades that followed. This event was an important moment in history, showing that even the most improbable mistakes can lead to global changes in military strategy and European politics. The process of realizing what had happened was part of the lesson learned by all countries. Coherence, command, and coordination are most important. The incident of the Battle of Kolin, despite its localized nature, had profound implications for the internal politics of the Austrian Empire. In the short term, the army suffered serious losses, and its internal administration was disorganized. In the longer term, however, the event prompted a rethinking of strategy with regard to both domestic coordination and international relations. Within Austria, a restructuring of the command system and the internal organization of the army began. It is important to note that the Habsburg monarchy was at that moment under serious pressure from both external enemies and internal conflicts within the empire itself. The difficulties faced by the Austrian army after Kolin were not the only challenges, and this battle only added to the general state of uncertainty. The consequences of the battle, both for the army and the monarchy, were not only the demoralization of the soldiers and their commanders, but also the need to revise the entire military doctrine. The authorities began to realize the importance of professionalism and command on the battlefield, as well as the need for tight coordination in large-scale battles. After the battle, the Austrian leadership began to develop new principles for cooperation between the different parts of the army. This involved innovations in communications, improved methods of communication and coordination of units, and a greater emphasis on the training of commanders. A new standard of education and training was created for the Austrian army, which included not only physical training, but also psychological training. Wise pundits and military analysts began to look at the psychology of the troops, realizing that mistakes on the battlefield could be due not only to technical problems, but also to a lack of clear command. For European politics, The Battle of Kolin was an unpredictable factor. The Austrian army, though still one of the leading armies in Europe, now faced doubts about its abilities. Neighboring powers began to analyze the incident to see how Austria's internal weakness could be exploited. However, despite the difficulties, the Austrian Empire did not lose its key allies. Including Prussia and France, who were concerned about strategic losses, continued their negotiations with the Austrians. Ironically, however, the Battle of Kolin also had an impact on the politics of France itself, which began to increase internal reforms and look for ways to further strengthen the army. Amidst the political changes, the Austrian army faced the new challenge of maintaining control over its territories. In some regions, such as Germany and Hungary, independent sentiments began to emerge, which also undermined the internal stability of the empire. The impact of the Battle of Kolin on international relations was also significant. Whereas Austria had previously been perceived as an invincible army, its ability to actually win was now in doubt. This point became a serious factor in negotiations with neighbors. This was particularly true of relations with Prussia, which had previously actively supported the Austrians against the French. After the incident with its own army, Prussia began to look for ways to strengthen its influence in Central Europe by strengthening its forces and building new alliances. In addition, Prussia began to look for ways to integrate its armies with Russian forces, which also served as a challenge to the Austrian Empire. Despite external threats, Austria's domestic politics continued to evolve, but the Battle of Kolin left a mark on its perception among neighboring countries, forcing governments to reconsider their strategic decisions. When the Kolin incident occurred, many countries in Europe began to rethink their strategies for military operations. This did not only apply to the Austrians, but to all the leading powers of the time. The emergence of internal confusion in armies, especially as the war was reaching a new level, demanded a higher level of training and clarity in command. The French army, for example, greatly increased its focus on command and coordination. Including the backdrop of events in Austria, the French Corps set about improving its military intelligence and communication systems. Reform in the army and increased training of commanders were key points in the process of preparing France for future wars. Meanwhile, the Russian army, also observing the situation, began to develop new tactics to interact with its allies, which later, during the Napoleonic Wars, led to closer military alliances between Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Although the Battle of Kolin, by and large, had no impact on changing the military and political map of Europe, it remains one of the most amazing examples of confusion and tragic error in military history. Today, centuries later, we can see it as a lesson in the importance of command, coordination, and understanding on the battlefield. It all reminds us that even the mightiest armies can face disaster because of a lack of clarity and mutual coordination. No matter how strong an army is, without effective command and mutual discipline, even the most powerful force can doom itself to defeat. The event at Kolin reminds us that war is not only a battle against an enemy, but also a test of tolerance, discipline, and the ability to respond to unexpected challenges. The Battle of Kolin, despite its strangeness and confusion, left a significant legacy in military history. The incident was a powerful lesson for future military strategists, armies, and commanders, reminding them how important cohesion, command, and proper coordination are on the battlefield. The mistakes of the Austrians showed that even the mightiest army can be defeated if its parts do not work as a unit. This event has become the dreaded example that all armies of the world, from young soldiers to top officers, are obliged to consider. Every element of war, from information sharing to command orders, matters. Even the slightest misunderstanding can lead to disastrous consequences. For the Austrians, and subsequently for the other armies of Europe, the Battle of Kolin was the extreme that forced them to rethink their military strategies. First and foremost, the focus was on mutual understanding between units. on creating a system that would prevent their forces from mistakenly clashing. Also, the battle became an example of the importance of clear command. Military strategy could no longer rely on chance. Information had to be obtained, verified, and communicated with the utmost accuracy. Otherwise, despite numerical superiority, armies risked finding themselves in a situation where their forces, instead of defeating the enemy, began to fight among themselves. The Battle of Kolin had an impact on military theories, shaping new approaches to managing armies and improving communication between different military units. All of this went down in history as a crucial lesson in the coordination of forces, which was later adopted as the basis for modern military strategies. In particular, military theories began to incorporate elements of tactical security, where each army was required to ensure that signals and commands did not cause confusion. The disaster also placed an emphasis on interactions between headquarters and units, which later became the basis for the first steps towards reorganizing armies. A key lesson from the Battle of Kolin was the need for quick reaction and rapidity in decision-making. Situations such as this, where an army fails to act as a cohesive unit, are fraught with consequences not only for the army, but for the whole country. In the future, especially in the 19th century, when large-scale wars such as the Napoleonic Wars began to engulf Europe, mistakes of this nature received special attention. For example, the lessons learned from the Battle of Kolin were heeded during the Napoleonic Wars, when rapid response, clear command, and teamwork became the basis of offensive operations and more effective defense. None of the European armies were indifferent to the Kolin incident. Napoleon, when studying military strategies, took into account how important it was to minimize the likelihood of error. This became the cornerstone of his own tactics, in which he rigidly coordinated his actions and used rapid and accurate communication between parts of his army. The French emperor also realized that military reforms in information sharing, intelligence, and command could be an important step towards winning future battles. The example of the Battle of Kolin was one of those reminders of the fragility of even the mightiest armies. This incident had a serious impact not only on military theory, but also on the psychology of soldiers. It is important to realize that the Battle of Kolin was not only a tactical error, but also a huge psychological shock to those involved. Many soldiers wondered after this engagement, how could this have happened? How did it happen that they fought against their own comrades without knowing who the enemy really was? Facing such situations has led military analysts and psychologists to focus on the psychological aspects of war, such as stress, demoralization, and the effects of chaos on soldiers. The Battle of Kolin was a lesson in the importance of minimizing uncertainty in a combat situation, so that soldiers are not stressed and do not make poor decisions. Although the Battle of Kolin took place many years ago, it remains an important historical lesson for modern armies. Today, in an era of rapid information sharing and new technologies, coordination and clear command are still the basis for winning any battle. Modern armed forces are actively working to avoid such incidents. The use of modern communications technology, satellite navigation systems, and automated command systems helps to minimize the potential for mistakes and misunderstandings on the battlefield. The Battle of Kolin, though strange and tragic, is an invaluable lesson for all of humanity. It reminds us of the importance not only of physical strength, but also of coordination, understanding, and coherence. Confusion on the battlefield, even among allies, can lead to irreversible consequences. As we wonder how such a mistake could have occurred, we not only study military history, but also remind ourselves that in a world full of chaos and uncertainty, it is important not only to be physically prepared to fight, but to be ready to act quickly and accurately in any situation. This battle is a reminder that the most important elements of success on the battlefield will always be psychology, command, and coordination. No matter how strong an army is, without clear cooperation, It will be doomed to mistakes and sometimes defeat. This is why the Battle of Kolin remains not just a historical incident, but a valuable lesson that will be useful for all future generations. Thank you for watching to the end. Share this video and post in the comments. What other mistakes do you think could have had such consequences in other wars? What lessons for the armies of today do you see in this incident?